And I'm going to ask my typical bad question. We ended up sort of post-flood. We've read through chapter 2 all the way up through chapter 9 now, so we've moved a little bit faster through the material. And I wanted to see if you had questions, comments, or concerns, either from the text or from the writings or something that you're bringing. Maybe you noticed something new, or maybe you liked something, or maybe something bothered you, or you'd like to hear the group's take on something. So with that terrible introduction, I'm just really trying to open the floor up.
Well, I appreciated your explaining, the difference in the narratives, especially about what animals were considered to be clean and what animals are not considered to be clean. And that, the second one was apparently written by the priestly account, and because of the emphasis on ritual and things of that sort. So those kinds of things helped me a great deal.
Thank you.
There we go.
Rhonda, please.
This was the time that what was it, Genesis 6 or something, that it's kind of referring to Enoch and kind of a whole different worldview there. And is Enoch the one that was like taken straight to heaven without dying?
So the text reads that he walked with God and was no more.
Okay.
And then there is a mythology that came out, and particularly that mythology was in place when the pseudepigraphal book of 1 Enoch was written. Just a little bit about that book. We call something pseudepigraphal if it is a writing attributed to a person who did not write it. So this was actually very popular to do in the ancient world, particularly around 100 BCE, as a good like targeting date. The book of Daniel is also pseudepigraphic, as are a number of Paul's writings, to be honest. I mean, most scholars would tell you Paul did not pen to Timothy. That's a pseudepigraphic. So it uses Paul's name, but he didn't write it. And of course, the name is used thematically to lend authority. It doesn't mean that it doesn't represent some form of like Paul's teachings that were passed down orally. It's just, quite honestly, when we look at the New Testament pseudepigrapha, like 2 Timothy doesn't have the same diction or syntax as, say, 1 Thessalonians, which scholars will tell you is the earliest writing of Paul. So, either Paul completely changed his writing style, grammar, vocabulary, or he just didn't write that. And usually the simplest explanation is the one you go with, right? So with 1 Enoch, Rhonda, the oldest version we have of 1 Enoch is not in Hebrew or Aramaic. It's actually in a script called Ethiopic. Gives you an idea where it came from, Ethiopia. And 1 Enoch almost made it into the Christian Bible at the Council of Constantinople in 380. To give you some perspective, the book of James made it by a hair, and the book of 1 Enoch didn't make it by a hair. You can read 1 Enoch on the internet, like it's free. You'll read a translation of it in English. It's a little weird. You have to understand when you read it, it's in a genre that like most of us are real weird about, like the genre of Revelation. So it's very symbolic. It doesn't mean it's predicting future events as much as it's trying to express to you the inner reality of things. So if you read it as like a poem or literary insight into sort of like the inner character, it's a little more useful. It talks about these things called watchers. 1 Enoch talks about, watchers are like these heavenly beings all over the place that are like God's eyes on stuff. It says, frankly, things we don't believe in, like there's 360 days on the solar calendar, or 364, I think, and that's not true. And it has this mythology that there were these metaphysical beings that had demigods, basically, and that shows up in Genesis. So 1 Enoch is a written account that explains some of the mythology behind Genesis 6, but you have to remember 1 Enoch is written like 700 years later. So it's not even original. And maybe it's helpful to hear the sons of God in Hebrew. That's called the B'nai Elohim. And it doesn't mean God's literal heavenly children, but there was a fixed number of those. And those are gods in the pantheon who are not the supreme God. That would be the God of the Bible. But originally, there's this understanding, and this is true by rabbis as well, that the sons of God were considered like, heavenly dukes and earls. So originally, the Hebrew Bible was, in fact, polytheistic. I hope that's helpful to hear. Monotheism, you won't even really see it unless you read 2nd Isaiah. Those are chapters 40 through 55. When you read 3rd Isaiah, 56 through 65, not monotheist. That's interesting. The only really monotheistic part of the Hebrew Bible is 2nd Isaiah. You notice when you hear the Decalogue, have no other gods before me, it doesn't mean there's not any other gods. You just can't worship them ahead of God. Or you may say like, oh, Mike, that's really interesting. It's really interesting when you hear that there is a polytheistic background going on. And if you're interested in that, you can read The Source by James Michener that describes that very well, or you can read The Red Tent by Anita Diamante that gives you a little bit of a fuller picture of how that might have looked. The Source is better, but Anita Diamante's book, The Red Tent, is still kind of fun. So Rhonda, according to 1 Enoch, there was I don't know if there's a rebellion in heaven. That's really John Milton. But really what happened is there's mixing of categories. And this becomes really interesting if you've read the book of Leviticus. Many people know there's a bunch of thou shalt nots, right? But a lot of thou shalt nots are thematically organized around not mixing categories. So I don't know if you know this, there's a word called abomination. And it really means don't do that or gross. And it is in fact abominable for you to wear a garment made of 2 kinds of fabric. Now that makes no sense, right? Because cotton polyester blends are amazing. We all know that and we're all wearing them. But part of it is you can't think through hey, what does that mean? Except for part of the priestly code is that the people are going to be set apart, not just with the way they live, but literally set apart. So one of the ways of being set apart is by not mixing categories. It's an abomination to plant 2 kinds of seed in the same field. Now, no, it isn't. That actually is really, really helpful for crop rotation. But in Leviticus, the goal is to really describe, hey, the way you're set apart is you don't mix categories. Now hear that, right, with the kinds of foods you can't eat. You can't eat the pig because even though it has a cloven hoof, it's an omnivore, and that's mixing categories. Hear that about male on male sexuality in Leviticus. The default category is hetero relationships. Male on male is mixing categories. I hope that makes sense. Leviticus is really trying to push a purity of monochromatic living. And the justification for it in Leviticus is everybody around you is doing all of these things and you're not going to be like them. You're going to be visibly different with your pure linen clothes. You're going to be visibly different with the way you plant your fields and the way you eat, so that people can identify who you are by looking at you. You're going to be visibly different because you don't cut your hair in these 5 places. So Enoch is talking about how the heavenly beings mix with the human beings, and that blurring of categories goes back to the primordial chaos in Genesis that God separated everything out from. I hope that makes sense. It's a good frame. By the way, the name of the rebellion is not Satan. If you read the Enoch, the leader of the sons of God is the Azazel, which is best translated to English as scapegoat. Who said it was Satan? John Milton. But Enoch is really clear. It's the Azazel. That was probably more information than you wanted to hear. But again, you can take a quick online jaunt through Enoch and start to realize there's a whole lot of legend and belief behind the Bible that we just have lost. And when we go to read it, we're like, not knowing that makes it a little bit difficult for us to figure out what the text meant when it was written.
Mike, with regard to God and the sons of God,
Yes.
I think if I understood you correctly, you said that there are other gods, and it's okay that, I mean, metaphorically speaking, I guess, that to worship them, but as long as God comes first and is supreme above all. Are we seeing any of that reflected in the Trinity, where there are three persons in one God?
You know, it's a great question, and I just finished reading this book by John Shelby Spong called Unbelievable, and he says something really, really interesting to me that I think is a good way of addressing that question, which is, to be honest, we can't really describe God linguistically. All we can really do is describe our experience of God. And so Trinity becomes a really helpful way to describe ways in which we experience God. But as to how God exactly is, that seems a little bit challenging. Now, we do it all the time, and Tim and I have been talked about this, and Tim gave me a great book called I Am God, and the beginning of the book says, I'm God, I don't think. I don't need to think. That's what y'all do. I mean, it's sort of really interesting how much we anthropomorphize God by saying God thinks and God gets mad. We get mad. Is there any reason to think that God has emotion? There's no reason to think that. We just do. So it's interesting to think what that does, Megan. And again, like for me, the Trinity is not so much an ontological description of God that's helpful as much as it is a goal setting. To me, the Trinity really says, look, God exists in community. And that seems really important to me theologically. Does God really exist in community? I don't know, but I sure do experience God that way. I don't know if that's helpful. Lila asked a really great question real fast. She asked, what about God being in the plural form in the first chapters of Genesis? And I want to hold this up to you for further reading again. I'm looking for it on my shelf. I've got it. It's super nerdy, Lila, and Antha asked about it too. It's a dissertation about where the word Elohim came from linguistically, written by one of my professors at Gardner-Webb who earned his PhD at Johns Hopkins, called Joel Burnett. Again, I have it, and it talks about why Elohim is a plural word, maybe. I mean, the truth is nobody really knows, but it amounts probably to something like the royal we. Probably that. So do they ever use the pronoun they? No, it's really the royal we. Just linguistically, that seems to be how it goes, Lila.
What do you mean the royal we?
Well, you know, when the queen says we are not amused, she's really talking about herself. Or if the queen says one does not care for your offering, she's really saying I don't. But royals have this way of speaking, right, that is different from common parlance. And so that seems to be the suggestion. So some Christian folk want to read the Trinity into the Hebrew Bible. And look, our Jewish brothers and sisters have decided kind of a long time ago, at least by 400 BCE, that there is no plurality in the Godhead. I mean, that's a decision they made. So to say like, oh, look, the Trinity's been there all along isn't really great. That's what I want to suggest to you. There was no idea, I don't think, of plurality in the Godhead, even though there was an idea of plurality in heaven. But you have to remember, the Hebrew Bible kind of views heaven as set up like a human court. There's a throne, and then there's attendants who serve. Like there's the president, and then there's the cabinet. But we don't devote our prayers to members of the heavenly cabinet, because like we've moved past that idea. Although I would tell you that most Christian people have hierarchicalized the Trinity, which is an interesting thing, right? That there's God the Father, and then there's God the Son, and then the least important one's the Holy Spirit.
I wanted to ask you, when you said God in community, can that be the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think the whole question, Rhonda, is like the Holy Spirit is doggone amorphous. And like, if you read the original Nicene Creed, the one written in 324, we believe in the Holy Spirit, period, end of the creed. The other part about with the Father and the Son, the Spirit is worshiped and glorified, that came in 380. Didn't come in the original. So I just think people don't know what to do with it. And if you know your Christian history, there was a real problem with the Holy Spirit, which is a guy came named Montanus showed up and said like Jesus was the incarnation of the Son. He said, I'm the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. And people thought maybe there was truth to that. And then the problem was he died and he didn't come back to life. And so there's been a lot of skepticism about the Holy Spirit since then, just to be honest. I may have meandered without answering anybody's questions, so I apologize. Lila, I hope that's helpful. Rhonda, before I gave that like amazing tirade, yeah, you were getting ready to comment, I think.
I was just, when you said God in community, that's when I thought of that question, and it just came back up.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you, was it new for anybody? This one came this morning, so perhaps you haven't read it yet. It's okay. Was it new to hear that Ham saw Dad naked, but maybe he did more than look?
That's new.
Yeah, that I didn't read that he did anything more. He just saw Dad walked in, there's Dad naked, walks out and says, hey, brothers, go in and cover him. That's how I read it. But then Noah goes on to say, I'm going to curse your son. I don't get it.
Yeah.
That's me. I don't get it.
Yeah, and Noah doesn't even curse his son. He curses one of his grandchildren, right? I mean, so the rabbis picked that up really fast, right? And they said, like, look, this is a little bit disproportionate. I will tell you, like, I think part of our puritanical, I don't want to speak to what you do in your homes, and I have some gratitude that I have not seen either of my parents naked. I'm actually pretty grateful for that. And in general, like, I behave that way at home as well, so that neither of my children have had that experience. And part of it comes from a very surface level read of this passage, right? But come on. I mean, that's what the rabbi said. The rabbi said, look, you don't curse your grandson because they saw you naked in your private room. Like, that's just weird. So Lila asked, what's it a euphemism for? Well, it depends which rabbi you read. Some people, though, basically think, and I put this in the thing, that maybe there was some date rape that happened. Now, that would be double crossing of categories, right? Because this would be male on male, and it would be with a family member, so it's incest, right? And basically what that would mean is a show of domination from the son over the father. You may say, Mike, that's really like out there. Well, that's what midrash is. It's out there, right? And so this is an ancient midrash that Ham raped Noah, and that Noah was so drunk that he couldn't resist.
Mike, that's one interpretation. Is there another as well?
Oh, well, yes, I was going to ask that. How do people will use this incident to say African Americans should serve the white people?
Oh, because, right, sometimes we read the Bible, but in general it reads us. And so what they decided, Tim, was that since this thing happened and Noah cursed his grandchild, which, by the way, you've got to be really drunk to curse your grandchild for something their father did. How do people read this? Well, they say, like, that's when color came into the world and black is bad. But it's a really funny thing, right? Because originally people were not white. So I think it would be much easier to hear that whiteness is the curse. But we don't do that because we're white. I mean, that's the curious thing. I mean, really, just consider reframing the story that way. The curse of Ham is whiteness. That's an interesting read. And by the way, That's not a foreign read if you're Egyptian or Middle Eastern, because that has been your experience of white people. Of course, we all understand scientifically that white skin is disadvantageous when you live near the equator. I hope we understand that. Kevin?
So, so first we have the cursing of Cain. Now we have the cursing of Ham. Does this trend ever really stop of these monumental over-the-top curses? Does it become less of a way of dealing with these problems as the text goes on?
Not in Genesis. So, we're going to read the Babel story, right? And after the end of the story, that people get scattered all over the world. Some people read that scattering as when color entered the world. But curses continue, like when Jacob's on his deathbed and he blesses his kids, he kind of blesses their hearts. I mean, like at least 2 of the kids come off with a straight up curse. Those are the origins of the priests, by the way. Like you read their blessing, it's not good. Like it's not one that you want. And Jacob holds it till his deathbed because then there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, that's a theme. One thing that Genesis does is it shows you how not to be a parent. It really is a cautionary tale of parenting. I want to hold up. And yeah, Kevin, it's really crazy when you read it because you could read this and say like, well, that's because you get what you deserve, or like, hey, that's how you're supposed to parent. But I do want to suggest that as Christian people, we've lost the ability to read these stories as cautionary tales. And I think it's really important to hear like, hey, when you curse your grandchild for something their parent did, that's the definition of sin and inequity and injustice. And instead of normalizing that, the question is to say like, oh my God, are our grandchildren having to pay the bill for behaviors we're doing now? And the answer is yes. And that's not okay. I think that's a very fair way to read the Bible. It is happening and it's not okay. Particularly, right, and we've been sold this bill of goods that all of the Hebrew people came from Egypt. But what's really interesting is when we exhume Hebrew tombs and do like DNA testing, their DNA is like the same as the Canaanites. I mean, it's not like Hebrew people were ethnically different from the Canaanites. That's really important to uphold. So what they don't have is a DNA difference, and therefore they need to have a behavioral difference. You're more than welcome to say that's hogwash, by the way. But I don't think it is.
No, I think that, well, that is still true today. Here we are in, of course, we have more mixed races now, but there was a time when America was predominantly white. And, you had good people and you had people who did things that were wrong. And so if you're going to be Christian, then you're going to live one way. And if you're not going to be Christian, then you may live another way. So there are those differences among us today. People who are honest, people who are not honest, and that's a way of life for them. And is that in the same framework?
I think it can be. And I don't know if this is interesting when we talk about race. I never learned this in high school or middle school. But I don't know if you realize that, like at the DNA level, by the way, 90% of my ancestry comes from the British Isles. I have more genetically in common with people from Africa than I do people from Poland. That's bizarre because I didn't learn that. But there's more genetic difference between tribal groups than there is from outside the tribe. That is like mind-blowing to me. I wish I'd learned that. And Meg, I really appreciate you saying, like, we're still just trying to figure that out. And of course, I mean, honestly, the evolution of our brains do support us living tribally. I mean, that's the faster thinking, but we do have this capacity to transcend that, frankly, where our evolutionary is going, because you know that our brain didn't like edit, it just added. Our brain's been added to, nothing's been deleted. So we have this opportunity, I think, to kind of like what Paul says, take all of our thoughts captive. It doesn't, I don't think that means like never have a bad thought. I think what it means is like we have this opportunity to use our human brain to help inform our reptilian brain and our mammalian brain. And hopefully we're able to like push past in our impulses of fight and flight and freeze to do something that is larger. Antha?
And isn't that one of the perspectives of the authors of Genesis, is this very universalist that all humanity is one family, that we all came from one family, and that even when they split out into all the nations and so forth, that still the emphasis is very universal.
That's what I'm arguing, and that's because, and maybe honestly, Antha, if I were to write these again in 3 years, I wouldn't argue that. But like, I just can't help but notice it's all over the place when you read this. And what's strange, right, is that we have a normative read that reinforces tribalism when the reading, like even the surface level reading, is not tribal. I mean, it's really interesting. It really speaks to what the history of interpretation does to us. Let me ask, had any of you heard before that the rainbow is God's weapon? I hope that's helpful to hear. What do you know? It's shaped like a bow and it shoots things and God puts the weapon down. And we don't approach it that way anymore. We don't. We just think it's this beautiful, refraction. But the people behind the text thought it was a weapon. I mean, if you were here during Hurricane Harvey, it's debatable as to whether or not that weapon was fully put down, right?
So that's how it became a sign of peace?
Yeah, because it's sort of like, the manners at the table are, you don't put the knife facing out and you always put the knife down when you're not using it. That came right from the idea you're not going to stab somebody while you're eating. So when you put the knife down with the blade facing yourself, that's a symbol, right? That, hey, it's going to take some ramp up to get to aggression. But so much of what we do, right, is that we think anachronistically. We think about what we're used to, and then we just read that backward into the text. So I want to suggest, right, I mean, the rainbow is really like taking an AK-47 and putting a spade on the end and using it to dig a hole. It's a real gun that can really shoot bullets that you cultivate with instead of shooting bullets out of. I don't know if you're comfortable with the idea that God was shooting an AK-47 down at the ground.
Yeah, I'm not
That's the
comfortable.
text.
I'm not comfortable with it because it says, I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Now, that doesn't imply shooting anybody.
Well, I mean, again, the bow was like a howitzer.
Yeah, I know, but the thing is this has got a loving, peaceful use, doesn't it?
I think only if you recognize that this is like God taking a nuclear warhead that used to work and disarming it. And it's really important to hear that, like, the nuclear warhead got used. Like Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened when the world got flooded. I mean, that happened. And that came from God's weapon, according to the text. And then God said, oh no, I won't do that again. But you need to hear, I won't do it again means I did it the first time. Now, here's where it's really important. Is that what God really did? Or is that how people understood God?
So, Mike, I think what you said there really is key for me. Is that what God really did, or is that the story that got recorded thousands of years ago to explain this horrible flood? I just find that to have any peace in my heart about all the scriptures, I have to come to some kind of I have to come to some kind of acceptance or understanding of this wrath. This wrath.
Yeah.
I mean, God doesn't change; people change, and so there.
Well, and I want to hold up, Lila, because you're going to hear this in church today if you watch it or if you read it, right? Jesus takes a whip and chases people out the temple, right?
Yeah.
And is that okay? And you're going to hear me say, no. The people he chased down, it's not like they were in charge of the thing. It's not like they orchestrated it. And being mad and like whipping somebody because they give you a robocall isn't going to stop the robocalls. Those people are working for minimum wage. They're trying to feed their family. So you can get real mad at them, but they didn't create that system. The system preys on them as much as it bothers you. And sometimes I think we read a text and we say, because Jesus did it, we should do it. And I want to suggest to you, some of these are cautionary tales. I mean, you go out and you start shooting Klansmen because they belong to the Ku Klux Klan. Is that godly? Is it going to work? No and no. So I think these texts really invite us to consider not just what do we settle for, but what should we be targeting? Maybe I'm heretical for saying that, but you know, like Lila, it's really hard for me to imagine that the God I believe in is committing genocide. This is really hard for me to imagine. So what do I have to do? Well, I don't have to reject the scriptures. I can say, what are they trying to tell me? And at a basic level, right? If God disarms, then maybe we should do that too. That seems like an important lesson. And I don't mean because it historically happened. I mean, what is the text inviting us to do? To be godly, we disarm. That sounded really political. I'm sorry.
If God is perfection and he knows everything that's going to happen before it happens because he created it all, then he must be trying to send us some message in these scriptures to understand how we are supposed to behave and understand the world around us. Oh, would that be correct?
Well, I think it's really hopeful to say part of our commitment and as people of faith is that these scriptures hold all things necessary for salvation. I have to say that to become a priest. But now what that means is an open invitation. John?
If God knows what's going to happen, then God knows the decisions we make. And if that's the case, we have no free will.
Now, maybe. I don't know if that's completely true. I mean, I will say, like, I could predict with 99% certainty what my children were going to do in a given situation. And I would still play that situation out. I would still give them the choice. Not because I was setting them up to fail. I guess you could argue that. I actually was trying to set them up so they could succeed.
Well, but if God knows what's going to happen, then God would know what decision one would make. And consequently, to my mind, that's no free will.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how to say that.
Question. I know it's a hard question because you can't answer it, but
No, I don't think you can answer, but Rhonda's going to.
Okay. I'm personally not sure that God is trapped inside time like we are.
Mhm.
God might see everything at once. You know, we don't understand God. And, you know, him seeing everything at once doesn't mean that he makes it happen. My trying to understand how it works.
Yeah, because we have free will, and so we have choices to make, and just because God might know what we're going to do, it's like sometimes you see your children or somebody else facing choices, and because you know them what they're going to do, but they're still doing it with their free will.
Yes, but God would then know the ramifications of that decision all the way down the line and how it affects everything beyond that decision.
Kevin, you got something?
Yeah. So the idea of constraint of choice or past as prologue being used as an argument against free will actually doesn't require a God at all. I've been encountering it through more philosophical avenues, and I really am coming to the understanding that free will is something that is almost axiomatic. You either accept that we do have some free will, even if we are constrained in what we are able to do, as in such as the conditions and the situations that Viktor Frankl wrote about. Right, he's in a concentration camp. His ability to act and to react is incredibly constrained, and yet he seems to argue that there's still choice and free will in the middle of that unimaginable constraint. And what I've found is I have to just assume free will. I could argue either way and get to the answer that you do or you do not. Now, as soon as you get to do not, you then beg the question, then what meaning can there possibly be, right? So I get out of the conundrum of if God knows, therefore there's no free will, by saying it doesn't make any sense to do anything if there isn't some amount of free will, no matter how constrained. And God knowing, seeing all of history, I have to take that as perhaps not a constraint. And I guess what I'm arguing for is we sort of have to come to an understanding of how that plays out for us. And usually that's saying if free will is not true, if we don't have it, then the consequences of it are so catastrophic that it just seems to upend everything else we understand about living as humans. My 2 cents.
And I want to suggest to you that this whole thought about free will is really our difficulty with how we anthropomorphize God. Because we imagine that God wants to be in control of decisions like we do. And I want to suggest that might be human and not divine. It doesn't mean that you have to believe in a particular thing, but you know, there's plenty of Christians I know who don't believe that God is a transcendent being like you and I are. They're coming to say things like God is the ground of all being, in whom we live and move and have our being, right? So that God doesn't, like out there, actually all of us are happening inside of God. And that's just a really different picture from the one that most of us grew up with in our heads. And I don't want to say one's right and one's wrong. I just want to say there's a lot of options. And sometimes, again, we're so stuck in the way we think about things that God must think like that too. But I mean, that doesn't make sense. And part of it, I think, has to do with our understanding of perfection. Understanding of perfection typically is binary, like there's a right, and then there's a bunch of wrong things. And I mean, my life experience isn't like that at all. There's what I choose and it has consequences. And very rarely have I chosen something where all of the consequences were bad.
But do you think that God knew what choice you were going to make ahead of time?
I'm getting to the point where I don't even care about that question. I don't know if that's okay to say. What do I think? I mean, I go around from a lot of different models, John, and like one of the models I have when I was a kid is God had a perfect linear plan for my life. And every time I did something wrong, I fell beneath that plan, and too bad, not going to get back up there. But then I've got a different model where every time I make a choice, God replots all possible outcomes. So that instead of God saying like the God of perfection, God is the God of possibility. To me, that's a more helpful image, right? Because quite honestly, like even with my own kids, they did something I didn't think was great. And then I was like, oh my God, well, that has opened some other doors for you that I now see are life-giving, even though before I couldn't see that.
Well, you know, I think the subject of free will is kind of like a rabbit hole. You know, it doesn't, that doesn't matter at all, I think.
Well, I like what you said, Mike, about the fact that you make a decision and God can see all of the potential consequences, not necessarily driving towards one or the other, one or another. He just sees them all. I get that. That makes sense. I mean, whether it's true or not, I don't know.
To me, that's a bigger God than the other one. And so really what I want to try to do theologically is trade up. I want to take what I had, and if I can see something that's bigger or more life-giving, I want to make a trade. And I want to continue to trade up, right? And particularly not just so I have this idea of perfection, but so I can live into it. And to me, this goes back to, I think, like one of the fundamental messages that we get in Genesis, if we pay attention, there's no people that are perfect in their piety or personality, and God isn't frustrated with that. So if I get frustrated with that, I'm not being godly. Like this to me is a good trade up I need to make. I'm struggling to make it, but it's a good trade. Like it's a trade up. It makes parenting a little bit harder. It was easier when I had objective norms and I could tell my daughter, do this, not that. But when I open myself to like, well, why does she have to wear clothes in the house? I mean, I know that sounds silly, but if you've got kids and you've ever paused to say like, why am I so committed to this thing that hasn't even served me well? Why do I want to push that on my kids? It's destabilizing. It is. I think it's a lot easier to make decisions that are morally black or white because it's comforting. You just do good decisions instead of, quite honestly, like there's a whole lot of gradient. There's a whole lot of gradient. And I think the more I open myself to the gradient, it's helpful for me to look at other people and not get so mad at them. Those money changers in the temple, they probably had kids they needed to feed. God, I hate that. I wish they were just evil, because then I could hate them. But if a communist is a dad or a mom trying to feed their children, it's a lot harder to hate communists. And that seems like a good trade. It seems like a trade up. I don't know if that makes sense. So does that mean everything's contextual and there's no capital T truth? I just think there's probably a lot fewer capital T truths than we want to pretend like there are. You know, and I'm going to talk about the Decalogue some this morning in the sermon, you know, honor your father and mother. What if they're abusing you? I mean, I guess you can honor them by getting them away and not talking to them again. I mean, you know, like that seems pretty contextual to me. And look, if we're going to talk about not making graven images, why do we have pictures of Jesus? That's idolatry. We do it, hopefully, so we have something that's accessible to us, but we also remember, right, that our image is really just a scaffolding and we're not supposed to just sit there. But a lot of times we settle into the image instead of using it as a way of going forward, right? This is why we hate in the Western church, we tend to not like icons. We're discovering them again. People do not pray to the icon. They're supposed to use the icon as a lens for which to direct their prayers. So, you know, is nothing good or bad? It's a really great question. I think there's a lot more gray than we usually think about. And I'm really clear that even some of the best things I did were not like completely good. They had things in them like selfishness, or they had like ways in which my personality likes to be the minority voice, because I love being the minority voice. I'm doing it right now. I love to do that, right? But that doesn't disqualify the goodness of it. I mean, this is really interesting. I was talking to somebody this week about like COVID and the difference between Americans mobilizing for COVID and Americans mobilizing for World War II. Right? So consider, during World War II, people did without stuff. They grew vegetables. They didn't eat out. They turned in the tinfoil from their gum, right? In COVID, people can't be bothered to put a scrap of fabric on their face. So what's changed? And my friend said, well, that's because World War II was a just war. And I just, you know, I don't know if I should say this because I'm going to sound really political, but one of my favorite people in Coronado, 4-star Admiral Bud Edney, said really clearly, there is no such thing as a just war. There might be just causes for war, but there's no just war. And to go back and say World War II was a good war, no, it wasn't. Lots of innocent people died. Lots of people were hurt, ours and theirs. That's not just. The ideology, right, is important, but when we say that it justifies what happens to innocent people, I don't know if that's really great. It's harder to think that way, which is why I think evangelicals are growing, because part of the evangelical theology is there's only one right and one wrong, and that's comforting to us. But to have to live with, hey, everything I do has got potential good and potential bad, that's a little destabilizing, don't you think? I just think it's true. I drive a Toyota Prius. It gets great gas mileage. The environmental impact of mining the metal for the battery is not good. That's what it means to have a hybrid car. Did I pick it because I care about the earth? Well, I did. I also cared about paying $4.50 a gallon for gasoline in California. I didn't want to do that for a car that got 15 miles to the gallon, because I get 50 miles to the gallon in my Prius. What's the better option? The Nissan Leaf, same metal in the battery. comes out of Africa. I mean, like it's not like we live in a binary world. And I think that's actually a really strong invitation. Sorry, I'm being really preachy here, but it's an invitation when we read the scriptures. Like I think it's a disservice that we read them in a binary fashion. How do you teach your kids that?
Mike, I
It's really
really,
tough. It's really tough. You know, the child brain doesn't like to function that way developmentally, right? So I think part of what we have to do is respect that, you know, like our brain capacity does in fact grow as we age. And there is such a thing as age appropriate, right? And like, I think teaching kids Bible stories is really important until they're about 12. And at that point, they need to know what to do with those stories. You can do a little bit of it together, right? But I used to teach at a high school where people were having to do like memory verses in the 12th grade. It's pedagogically very poor. The adolescent brain needs engagement. Like, why does this matter? The child brain is really happy just to do rote. I mean, it really is. It really is there, right? You have spent, since you were 6, more time severing connections than you have making them. So making new connections, giving people rote skills, really, really important when they're kids. But again, how we do it is really important. Like at St. Thomas School here, we tell the Abraham story and we say, Abraham thought God wanted him to sacrifice his son. And what do you think? And my 4-year-olds say like, no, God wouldn't say that. And I think they're right. But you can also say, can you understand why Abraham might have thought that, even though he's wrong? Because the more important thing you give to God, the more important the return back you'll get. Well, I would never do that with my own kid. Good. And can you understand the thinking? Because until you can understand the thinking, you probably will do that. I mean, that I think is a really important developmental lesson that kids can, in fact, learn. And it's all in the way that we teach these stories. Does God get mad as hell and throw a temper tantrum and drown humanity? I hope not. Lila?
so Mike, I just appreciate so much the thoughtfulness that you put into these mornings, especially this idea about the way we teach these stories. And thank you.
I mostly want to talk about the one today because it's the freshest in my mind, right? I mean, look, if you're a woman and you go to a public space, especially when you're in college, you have to keep your hand over your damn glass the whole time. This story is about that. That's not okay. That is not okay. The story is about that. It's not about something that happened a long, long time ago between some guy and his kid. If we read the scriptures faithfully, it's about elder abuse, and it's about misogyny, and it's about people being treated as objects and having to function in a society where there's no mutual trust or looking out for one another. And hey, that describes us because that happens, but it's not okay. To me, reading the scriptures like that actually matters. And relegating them to a fact pattern about what God did or didn't do 9 million years ago is not really that meaningful to me. I don't know if that's helpful.
It's getting near time to leave, but maybe at some point next week you can talk about what was the point of writing this? Why would the rabbis write this story? What was going on at the time that caused them to feel they needed to write this story?
Yeah, that's tough, John. I mean, it really depends on what dates you choose to believe this was initially written and edited in. But I do think hearing about the flood is really important to think about, honestly, less as a historical event and more as a figurative reality. Floods are about chaos, right? And coming out of chaos with some order for the sake of living seems to be really, really important. And in general, what people will say is like the dominant editing came after the Babylonian captivity, where guess what? People were absolutely engulfed in chaos. They lost their whole theological system when that temple got burned down. And they had to either say, God is dead, God has left us, or we were wrong about something.
But I guess I'm speaking specifically about this morning's reading.
Oh, about
And-
Noah and the stuff?
Yeah, again, you don't have to, we can talk about it the next time, but I'd like to know, why would they write that? What
Well,
was going on?
yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, look, there's a lot of possibilities, and I can't nail one down as like the only one, right? But again, like, hey, look, if we all come from common lineage, why are some people with us and some aren't? And particularly, like, if we're trying to carve out some space for ourselves among our ancestors, the Canaanites, why are they doing these things that they should not be doing? Must be because they're cursed. It's just one possibility. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say there's only one meaning here. Sandra?
When we lived in Australia, there was a major hurricane or tsunami or something that destroyed a whole lot of northwestern Australia. But the story was that because the Aborigines had this in their background, they knew how to accept it and how to move on. And maybe that's partly why this story of the flood is in the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, I really think, again, it's really helpful to imagine there's lots of ways we can hear the story that are instructive and helpful. Sometimes we hear these stories, again, as cautionary tales, and that the criterion about it's not about right or wrong, it's what's life-giving and what connects us to human beings who we'd like to believe are different and less than us. Like, what overturns that? What leads us to trading up what we have instead of hunkering down with where we are? To me, those are the readings that matter, right? So if we read the scriptures and we feel like more defended in our way of life, we've probably misread them. Not because we're bad, but because, look, we want to stretch out, I think, and not ball up. I mean, I don't want to live my life all, bent over with my shoulders all bent in. I'd like to be able to stand up and stretch. Figuratively. Grateful for your time, everybody, and sorry I was so preachy. Promise I'll be less preachy next week.